He was a powerful man who thought he could control everything. Until his daughter's life was placed in the hands of a black doctor he refused to trust. What happens when the only person who can save your child is someone you've judged unfairly your whole life? Will his prejudice cost him the one thing he loves the most? Or will he learn a lesson that changes everything? Before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching or listening from today, and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. The day had started like any other for Jacob Fenton. A man of wealth and influence, he was used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. His business empire stretched across several states, and he commanded a level of respect that came with decades of financial success. Yet, despite all the power he wielded in the boardroom, nothing could have prepared him for the phone call that shattered his world. "Mr. Fenton," the voice on the other end was steady, clinical. "Your daughter, Emily, she's in the hospital. There's been an accident." In that moment, time slowed. His breath caught in his throat as his mind raced to comprehend the words. Emily, his only child, the light of his life, had been hurt. Without asking for details, Jacob rushed to the hospital, a luxury SUV taking him through the busy streets of New York. The traffic, the constant hum of city life, it all faded away, replaced by a singular thought: his daughter. When he finally arrived at the hospital, he was greeted by a flurry of medical staff rushing about. The bright lights and antiseptic smell hit him all at once, but his focus remained singular. Where's Emily? He barged through the automatic doors of the ER, his mind frantic with worry, until he spotted a nurse at the front desk. "Where's my daughter? Emily Fenton. I need to see her now." His voice was sharp, a mixture of desperation and command. His reputation often preceded him, and most people bent to his demands without question. The nurse, calm despite his tone, looked at her screen. "She's in room 412, Mr. Fenton. The doctors are with her now." The words "doctors" barely registered as Jacob turned on his heel and made his way to the room. The hospital corridors seemed endless, sterile, as he passed by stretchers, gurneys, and anxious families. But none of it mattered. He needed to see his daughter. When he finally reached room 412, his heart nearly stopped. Emily, his beautiful, vibrant 16-year-old girl, lay pale and unconscious on the bed, a maze of tubes and wires connecting her to machines. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only reassurance that she was still with him. His breath came in short, painful bursts as he stepped closer, feeling completely powerless for the first time in his life. A nurse stood beside Emily, adjusting the IV drip, and at that moment, Jacob's eyes fell on the man standing at the foot of the bed. He wore a white coat, stethoscope draped around his neck, and was reviewing a chart with calm focus. "I'm Dr. Samuel Green," the man said as he extended a hand toward Jacob. But Jacob didn't move. His eyes narrowed as he sized up the doctor in front of him, a tall, calm black man, speaking with authority. The image sent a wave of discomfort through him, a feeling that tugged at the deep-seated prejudices he had carried with him for most of his life. "I'm Emily's father," Jacob said, ignoring the outstretched hand. His tone was cold, his eyes fixated on the doctor. "What's going on? What happened to my daughter?" Dr. Green lowered his hand slowly, the moment passing without acknowledgement. He maintained his professional demeanor. "Your daughter was involved in a car accident, Mr. Fenton. She suffered a severe head injury and some internal trauma. We're monitoring her closely, but the next few hours are critical." Jacob's stomach twisted at the words. Head injury, trauma, critical. "And you're the one treating her?" "Yes," Dr. Green replied, his voice calm and confident. "I'm the lead physician overseeing her care. I specialize in trauma cases like this." Jacob's eyes flared with a mix of disbelief and distrust. He didn't say the words aloud, but they burned in his mind. "Isn't there anyone else?" The doctor seemed to sense Jacob's unease, but he continued, unfazed. "We've already performed initial scans. and we're working to stabilize her condition. We'll need to monitor her for signs of swelling in the brain. It's imperative that we act quickly and precisely." "Quickly and precisely," Jacob repeated, his voice rising. "You're talking about my daughter's life here. I want the best care for her. Do you understand that?" Dr. Green met his gaze steadily. "That's exactly what I intend to provide, Mr. Fenton." But Jacob couldn't shake the anger and suspicion boiling beneath the surface. His emotions were a whirlwind of fear, and it was easier to direct them at the person in front of him, the man who didn't fit into Jacob's narrow definition of what a doctor should be. It was an ugly, unspoken truth, buried under layers of privilege and ignorance, but it was there nonetheless. A black doctor handling his daughter's life? It grated against every bias Jacob had never bothered to question. "I'm going to need a second opinion," Jacob said, his voice sharp. "This is my daughter. I won't take any chances." Dr. Green's expression didn't change. He'd faced men like Jacob before, men whose wealth and status shielded them from their own biases. "Of course. You're welcome to seek one, Mr. Fenton, but time is of the essence. I'd recommend we focus on your daughter's care right now." Jacob's eyes burned with frustration, but before he could respond, a nurse entered the room, interrupting the moment. "Doctor, Emily's latest vitals are ready." Dr. Green nodded and turned to check the charts. Jacob stood frozen by his daughter's side, his emotions a toxic mix of fear, anger, and something else he didn't want to name. He had always prided himself on making decisions that protected his family, but this was something he couldn't control. The hours dragged by as Jacob sat by Emily's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with the rhythm of the machines. Nurses came and went, adjusting medications and taking notes, but Dr. Green remained a constant presence, monitoring every aspect of her condition with calm precision. Jacob's mind raced, battling with himself. On the one hand, his instincts as a father screamed at him to do whatever it took to save his daughter, even if it meant trusting this doctor. But on the other hand, his ingrained prejudices clouded his judgment. He looked at Dr. Green again, watching the man move with quiet confidence. It unnerved him how composed the doctor was, how unfazed he seemed by the situation. Didn't he understand the gravity of it all? Or was he just indifferent? Jacob's frustration festered. He wanted answers, and he wanted them from someone who fit his idea of a real doctor. His fingers itched to make a call, to pull strings and demand a replacement. But Emily's condition was too fragile, and despite everything, Jacob knew that time wasn't on his side. The minutes stretched into hours, and still, Jacob sat beside Emily's bed, his mind racing with every beep of the machines. He had barely left her side since the accident, every fiber of his being focused on one thing, her survival. But the weight of his thoughts pressed harder and harder as he struggled to make sense of the situation. Jacob had built his entire life on control. He controlled his businesses, his relationships, his future. Yet now, sitting in this sterile room, he was powerless. The decisions were out of his hands, and it gnawed at him, especially because those decisions were being made by someone he had already judged, someone he couldn't trust for reasons he didn't fully understand, but could feel in his gut. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but Jacob ignored it. He didn't have the energy to deal with the outside world. His empire could wait. Nothing mattered more than Emily. She had been everything to him since her mother passed when Emily was just 10 years old. Raising her alone, he'd poured his heart and soul into providing her with a life of privilege, private schools, vacations abroad, a future set for success. He couldn't lose her. Suddenly, a soft knock on the door broke his reverie. Jacob glanced up as a familiar figure entered the room. "Jacob," the man said softly, his voice tinged with sympathy. It was his business partner, Charles Reed. Charles had rushed over the moment he heard about the accident, and now he stood at the doorway, his expression heavy with concern. "How is she?" Jacob ran a hand through his graying hair and let out a long, shaky breath. "She's hanging on," he said quietly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "But I don't know. I don't know if she's going to pull through." Charles stepped further into the room, placing a comforting hand on Jacob's shoulder. He was a tall man, with silver hair, and the kind of firm handshake that came from years of negotiation. Charles had known Jacob for decades. They'd built their business empire together, and there wasn't much that could shake their bond. "She's strong," Charles said softly, his eyes moving to Emily's still form on the bed. "She'll get through this." "I'm not sure." Jacob swallowed hard. "The doctor, this Dr. Green, he says he's doing everything he can, but I don't trust him. I need to get someone else in here." Charles raised an eyebrow. "You don't trust him? Why?" Jacob hesitated, his words stuck in his throat. He couldn't quite put it into words, not in a way that wouldn't make him sound, well, like the man he was. I don't feel comfortable with him handling Emily's care." Charles gave him a long look, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Jacob, you're talking about your daughter's life here. If this doctor is doing everything he can, that's what matters, right?" Jacob shook his head. "I'm not saying he's not qualified, but what?" Charles asked, his voice patient but firm. "You've got the best doctors in this hospital on her case, Jacob. What's bothering you?" Jacob clenched his jaw, his eyes hardening. He knew what was bothering him, but how could he say it out loud? How could he admit that he didn't trust Dr. Green simply because of the color of his skin? That old, deep-rooted prejudice. It had never surfaced in such a stark way until now, but it was there, undeniable. "I just don't want to take any chances," Jacob muttered, deflecting the question. "I'm going to find someone else." Charles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Jacob's face, reading the tension, the fear, and something else he hadn't expected to see. "Jacob," he said slowly, "if you're making this decision because of who the doctor is, rather than what he's doing, you might be making a mistake. You need to focus on Emily's care, not on—" "I'm not being irrational," Jacob snapped, his voice rising. The anger that had been simmering finally bubbled over. "This is my daughter we're talking about. I have the right to make sure she's in the best hands." "Of course you do," Charles said evenly, not rising to the provocation. "But you need to ask yourself, are you sure you're not letting your own biases get in the way here?" Jacob stiffened. The word bias felt like a slap to the face, and it triggered something defensive in him. He had never considered himself a prejudiced man, at least not openly. He employed hundreds of people from different backgrounds, and he'd always prided himself on being fair. Yet, here he was, questioning the competence of a doctor simply because of his race. His mind churned with the conflict. Was he being unfair? Was Charles right? But then, another voice inside him argued. This was his daughter. He had every right to demand perfection. The tension between them hung in the air for a long moment. Finally, Charles sighed and stepped back. "Jacob, I understand you're scared. We all are. But I think you need to trust the people who are here to help your daughter. If you get another doctor, fine, but don't let this be about anything other than what's best for her." Jacob didn't reply, his jaw still clenched tightly as Charles gave him a small nod and left the room, leaving Jacob alone once again with his thoughts, and with Dr. Green. As the hours dragged on, Jacob found himself pacing the hospital hallways, his emotions a storm of fear and anger. Emily's condition remained critical, and the helplessness gnawed at him. He was used to being the man in control, but now, with his daughter's life hanging in the balance, all of his usual defenses seemed to crumble. He passed by nurses, patients, and doctors, his mind racing with possibilities. How could he just sit back and trust this doctor? How could he let someone he didn't know, someone he didn't fully trust, take charge of his daughter's life? When he finally returned to Emily's room, Dr. Green was there, calmly checking her charts. The doctor glanced up as Jacob entered, giving him a brief nod before returning to his work. "How is she?" Jacob asked, his voice tense. Dr. Green paused, setting down the chart. She's stable, for now, but we're still watching her closely for any changes. It's too early to tell, but I'm optimistic. Jacob felt the words wash over him, but they didn't bring the relief he'd hoped for. Instead, they only seemed to heighten his anxiety. He crossed his arms tightly, staring at his daughter's pale face, her body so still it almost didn't seem real. Mr. Fenton, Dr. Green said after a moment, his voice measured. I know this is a difficult time for you, but I want to assure you that we're doing everything we can to help Emily. Jacob's jaw clenched. He wanted to believe him, but the doubt lingered, nagging at him. He turned to face the doctor, his eyes sharp. I'm not questioning your expertise, doctor. He began slowly, choosing his words carefully. But I'm wondering if maybe we need another opinion on this. Dr. Green met his gaze evenly, his face unreadable. I understand your concern, he said calmly. You're her father, and it's natural to want the best care for her. But I believe that right now, the most important thing is to focus on her recovery. Jacob didn't respond, his thoughts racing. There it was again, that calm, measured tone that seemed to challenge everything he felt. How could Dr. Green remain so composed, so sure of himself, when everything felt like it was falling apart? But before Jacob could say another word, a sudden alarm beeped from one of the machines. Both men turned to the monitor, and Dr. Green's face immediately shifted from calm to focused. Her oxygen levels are dropping, he said quickly, moving to the bedside and calling for the nurse. Panic surged through Jacob as he watched the medical team spring into action. Everything seemed to happen in a blur. The nurses adjusting the machines, Dr. Green issuing commands with precision, and Jacob, frozen in place, unable to do anything but watch. Is she... Jacob began, but his voice caught in his throat. His heart pounded as he watched the numbers on the monitor fluctuate. For the first time, he realized how completely out of his depth he was. He had no control here. None at all. Jacob watched, paralyzed, as the medical team rushed around Emily's bed. The soft, steady beeping of the heart monitor had shifted to a rapid, unsettling rhythm. Dr. Green's calm but urgent voice called out instructions to the nurses, his every word measured and deliberate. Her oxygen levels are unstable. Increase the O2 flow, Dr. Green ordered, his eyes flicking to the monitor. The nurses moved swiftly, adjusting tubes and wires while Jacob stood helpless in the corner, his mind a fog of fear and confusion. For the first time in his life, Jacob felt utterly powerless. This was his daughter, the one person in the world he had vowed to protect at all costs. And here he was, reduced to a bystander, unable to do anything but watch as others fought to save her. The minutes stretched out painfully, each second filled with the mechanical hum of machines and the quiet, focused urgency of the medical staff. The sight of Dr. Green moving with such precision, controlling the chaos with a calm that Jacob found unnerving, only deepened the gnawing pit in his stomach. But as much as Jacob wanted to lash out, to find someone to blame for this terrifying moment, he couldn't. His anger, his fear, all of it twisted inside him, but the reality was undeniable. Emily's fate was in the hands of the very man he didn't trust. When the crisis passed and the machine steadied, Jacob let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Dr. Green wiped his brow and turned to him, his expression serious but calm. We've stabilized her, Dr. Green said, his voice steady. But we're not out of the woods yet. I'm going to run some more tests to ensure there's no swelling in her brain. Right now, it's critical that we stay on top of every change. Jacob nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he watched as Dr. Green left the room, the tension still thick in the air. He sank into the chair beside Emily's bed, his hands shaking slightly. The sight of his daughter, so pale and fragile, hooked up to machines that were keeping her alive, overwhelmed him. He couldn't lose her. he wouldn't. For a long time, Jacob sat in silence, his mind reeling. Everything felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. His eyes kept drifting to the door, half expecting Dr. Green to return with more bad news. But the room remained quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines. As the minutes passed, Jacob's thoughts circled back to the conversation he'd had with Charles earlier. The word bias echoed in his mind, and the uncomfortable truth he'd been trying to avoid for so long began to claw its way to the surface. Was he really letting his own prejudice cloud his judgment? Was he putting his daughter's life at risk because of it? He'd always thought of himself as a reasonable man, someone who judged people based on their abilities, not their skin color. But now, faced with this situation, he couldn't ignore the fact that his distrust of Dr. Green had nothing to do with the man's medical expertise, and everything to do with who he was. The realization hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. He had spent his entire life in a world where his wealth and privilege shielded him from uncomfortable truths. But now, sitting in this hospital room, he couldn't hide from them any longer. The following morning, Jacob woke to the sound of quiet murmurs outside Emily's room. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had overtaken him sometime during the night. He blinked groggily and glanced at the clock. It was just past 6 a.m. Dr. Green stood near the door, speaking in hushed tones to one of the nurses. His face was calm, as always, but there was a hint of weariness in his eyes. Jacob straightened in his chair as Dr. Green approached. "How is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Green glanced at the chart in his hand. "Emily's condition is stable for now," he said. "Her oxygen levels have improved, and we're seeing some positive signs, but she's not out of the danger zone yet. We need to monitor her closely for any further complications." Jacob nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. "And the tests? What about the swelling?" "We're running a CT scan this morning to check for any signs of swelling in the brain. I'll keep you updated as soon as we have more information." For the first time since Emily had been admitted to the hospital, Jacob felt a small flicker of hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. He looked at Dr. Green, and for a moment, the distrust that had colored every interaction between them seemed to fade. Jacob hesitated, then spoke. "Dr. Green," he began slowly, "I know I haven't been easy to deal with, and I realize I've let my own biases affect how I've seen you." The words felt heavy on his tongue, but they needed to be said. "I just want to say, I appreciate everything you've done for Emily." Dr. Green looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Fenton," he said quietly. "I understand this is a difficult situation for you. My only goal is to give your daughter the best care possible." Jacob nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. There was so much more he wanted to say, about how wrong he'd been, about how he'd let his own ignorance blind him. But the words seemed inadequate. Instead, he simply said, "I trust you." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of a profound shift. For the first time since Emily's accident, Jacob was beginning to let go of the fear and prejudice that had clouded his judgment. He was starting to see Dr. Green for what he truly was, a skilled, compassionate doctor who was doing everything in his power to save his daughter's life. Hours passed in a blur of tension and waiting. Jacob remained by Emily's side, watching as the nurses checked her vitals and adjusted her medications. Dr. Green came and went, always calm, always focused. The hospital's routine buzzed on around them, but Jacob was locked in his own world, one where the only thing that mattered was Emily's fragile health. By late afternoon, the results of the CT scan came back. Dr. Green entered the room, his face as composed as ever, but there was a slight tightness in his expression that Jacob couldn't ignore. "We've reviewed the scans," Dr. Green said, his voice steady but serious. There is some swelling in her brain. It's not as severe as we feared, but it's still a concern. We're going to need to take immediate action to relieve the pressure." Jacob's heart sank. "What does that mean? Surgery?" Dr. Green nodded. "Yes. It's a delicate procedure, but it's necessary to ensure that the swelling doesn't cause further damage." Jacob's mind raced. Surgery. It was what he had dreaded the most. "And you're going to perform it?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. "Yes," Dr. Green replied, meeting Jacob's gaze evenly. "I'll be leading the surgical team. I've performed this procedure many times, and I'm confident it's the best course of action for Emily." Jacob felt a wave of fear crash over him. The thought of his daughter undergoing surgery, any surgery, was terrifying. But even more terrifying was the realization that, for the first time in his life, he had to put his trust in someone he had once dismissed based on nothing but the color of their skin. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to push the fear aside. This was no longer about him. It was about Emily. And if Dr. Green was her best chance at survival, then Jacob would have to trust him. "Do whatever you need to do," Jacob said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his decision. "Just save my daughter." Dr. Green nodded, a quiet determination in his eyes. "We'll take good care of her, Mr. Fenton. I promise." The sterile walls of the hospital waiting room seemed to close in around Jacob as he sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in his mind, each passing second dragging on like an eternity. Emily was in surgery, her life in the hands of Dr. Green. For the first time in his life, Jacob was forced to relinquish control, to trust someone else with the most important thing in his world. He had never felt so helpless. Across the room, other families sat in quiet anguish, waiting for news of their loved ones. Jacob could feel their anxiety like a palpable presence, but he couldn't bring himself to connect with them. His own fear was too consuming. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios, the thought of losing Emily gnawing at him relentlessly. A nurse had informed him that the surgery would take several hours, and that it was best for him to wait in the designated area. But how could he sit here, doing nothing, when his daughter's life was on the line? He tried to distract himself, pulling out his phone to check emails, messages, anything to take his mind off the suffocating dread. But each attempt at distraction felt hollow. His business, his wealth, his status, none of it mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was Emily. Jacob closed his eyes, leaning back in the stiff chair. He replayed the events of the past few days in his mind, his thoughts circling back to Dr. Green. He had never imagined that he would find himself in this position, forced to confront his own biases while his daughter lay on the operating table. How had he let it get this far? How had he allowed his own ignorance to blind him to what truly mattered? Jacob had spent his entire life building walls of power, wealth, and privilege that had shielded him from uncomfortable truths. He had never had to confront his own prejudice because, in his world, it was rarely challenged. But now, those walls were crumbling, leaving him exposed to the ugly truth of who he had become. Dr. Green had never once shown anger or frustration in the face of Jacob's distrust. He had remained calm, professional, and focused on what truly mattered: Emily's life. It was a lesson Jacob was learning far too late, but one that was now impossible to ignore. The door to the waiting room creaked open, and Jacob's heart leapt in his chest. A nurse stepped inside, her expression neutral but purposeful. "Mr. Fenton," she said quietly, "the surgery is still in progress, but Dr. Green wanted me to inform you that everything is going smoothly so far." Jacob exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The nurse gave him a reassuring nod before leaving the room, the door closing softly behind her. For a brief moment, Jacob felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Time seemed to lose all meaning as Jacob waited for news. His mind wandered, drifting back to memories of Emily as a little girl. He remembered the first time she had ridden a bike, wobbling down the driveway with a determined look on her face. He had been so proud of her, so certain that she would grow up to be strong, independent, and successful. But none of his wealth, none of his connections, could protect her from this. All the plans he had for her future, her education, her career, her happiness, hung in the balance. And it was a man he had once dismissed who now held her fate in his hands. Jacob thought back to the moments before the surgery, when Dr. Green had spoken with him, calm and composed. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to save Emily's life. It was a confidence that Jacob, in his fear and prejudice, had mistaken for indifference. But now, sitting alone in this waiting room, Jacob could see the truth. Dr. Green wasn't indifferent. He was focused. He was doing everything in his power to save Emily, just as Jacob had always done everything in his power to protect her. The difference was that Dr. Green had the skills, the knowledge, and the experience to save her in a way that Jacob never could. The thought brought a bitter taste to Jacob's mouth. He had spent so much of his life priding himself on being the protector, the provider. But now, he was powerless, dependent on the very man he had distrusted, and it was because of that man that Emily had a chance. Jacob's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the waiting room door opening again. This time it was Dr. Green who stepped inside. His white coat was slightly wrinkled from the hours in surgery, but his expression was calm, steady, and reassuring. "Mr. Fenton," he said quietly, "the surgery was a success." Jacob's heart seemed to stop for a moment. She's going to be okay?" Dr. Green nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, we were able to relieve the pressure in her brain, and she's stable now. She'll need time to recover, but the prognosis is good." Jacob felt a wave of relief crash over him, so powerful that it nearly brought him to his knees. He had been holding on to so much fear, so much doubt, that the news felt almost unreal. He stood there, staring at Dr. Green, unable to find the words. "Thank you," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving my daughter." Dr. Green gave a small nod. "It's what we're here for, Mr. Fenton. Emily's a strong young woman. She's got a good chance of making a full recovery." Jacob felt his eyes well up with tears, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For so long he had believed that strength meant holding everything inside, that control was the key to success. But now, in this moment, he realized that real strength came from something else, from trusting others, from letting go of the things that didn't matter, and from facing the uncomfortable truths about himself. "Dr. Green," Jacob began, his voice wavering, "I owe you an apology. I let my own ignorance get in the way. I judged you before I even gave you a chance. And for that, I'm sorry." Dr. Green's expression softened. "Mr. Fenton, I understand. These situations bring out a lot of emotions in people. What matters is that your daughter is safe, and she's going to be okay." Jacob swallowed hard, nodding. "Still, I was wrong, and I need you to know that I see that now." Dr. Green offered a kind smile. "Thank you. I appreciate that. But the most important thing right now is that Emily recovers." Jacob nodded, feeling the weight of his apology settle between them. It wasn't enough to undo the mistakes he had made, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt a sense of clarity. In the days that followed the surgery, Emily's condition steadily improved. The swelling in her brain subsided, and she began to regain consciousness, slowly but surely. Jacob remained by her side through it all, watching over her with a quiet sense of gratitude and humility. Every time Dr. Green entered the room to check on her, Jacob felt a mixture of awe and respect for the man he had once so deeply mistrusted. Dr. Green's expertise, his compassion, and his unwavering dedication to Emily's care had not only saved her life, but had also forced Jacob to confront the ugliness within himself. It wasn't easy to admit that he had been wrong. It wasn't easy to face the fact that he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. But as he watched Emily slowly regain her strength, Jacob knew that he couldn't continue to live the way he had before. Change was hard, but it was necessary. One afternoon, as Dr. Green finished checking Emily's vitals, Jacob stood up from his chair. "Dr. Green," he said quietly, "I know I've said this before, but I just want to say it again. Thank you. You've not only saved my daughter's life, you've changed mine." Dr. Green looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "It's been my privilege to help, Mr. Fenton. I'm glad to see Emily doing so well." Jacob smiled, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in days. "She's a fighter, just like her mother was." Dr. Green's expression softened. "I have no doubt she'll make a full recovery." As Dr. Green left the room, Jacob sat back down beside Emily's bed, watching her sleep peacefully. He knew that there were still challenges ahead, that recovery would take time, but for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt hopeful. And more than that, he felt changed. The days that followed were a blur of cautious optimism. Emily was recovering well, her body slowly regaining strength, and her consciousness returning in gentle waves. Jacob spent nearly every waking moment at her side, his heart lightening with each small victory. The first time she opened her eyes, the first time she squeezed his hand, the first few words she whispered in a raspy voice, all of it filled him with a hope he hadn't dared to feel in weeks. "Dad." Emily's voice was weak but steady, her eyes flickering open as she glanced at him. "What happened?" Jacob swallowed hard, his emotions a jumble of relief and fear as he leaned closer. "You were in an accident, sweetheart, but you're going to be okay. The doctors, they've taken good care of you." Emily blinked, her brow furrowing slightly as if trying to piece together the fragments of memory. "I don't remember much, just the car, and then nothing." Jacob smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "That's okay. You don't need to worry about that now. The important thing is that you're here, and you're getting better." Emily nodded weakly, her eyes drifting shut again as exhaustion overtook her. Jacob watched her for a long time, his heart filled with gratitude and something else, a quiet, humbling sense of perspective. He had spent so much of his life focused on control, on being the man who had all the answers, but now he understood that some things were beyond his grasp. And that was okay. As Emily continued to recover, Dr. Green remained a steady presence, checking in on her daily and offering updates on her progress. Each time he entered the room, Jacob felt a renewed sense of respect for the man who had saved his daughter's life. It wasn't just Dr. Green's medical expertise that impressed Jacob. It was his calm, unflinching compassion, his ability to see past the surface and focus on what truly mattered. Dr. Green had treated Emily not as a case, but as a person. And in doing so, he had forced Jacob to confront the biases that had clouded his own judgment for far too long. 2 weeks after the surgery, Emily was strong enough to be moved from the intensive care unit to a regular hospital room. The nurses smiled as they wheeled her bed down the hall, and Jacob followed closely behind, his heart swelling with pride as he saw how far she had come. The new room was brighter, filled with natural light from a large window overlooking the city. Emily smiled weakly as she was settled into the bed, her eyes drifting toward the window. "Look at that view," she murmured. "It's beautiful." Jacob stood beside her, his hand resting on the railing of the bed. "Not as beautiful as seeing you getting better," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily gave him a soft smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thanks for staying with me, Dad." Jacob's throat tightened. He had always been there for her. At least he had thought so. But now, in the quiet of this hospital room, he realized that being there wasn't just about providing, about making sure she had the best education or the most comfortable life. It was about something deeper, something he had almost missed. He had nearly let his own ignorance get in the way of what truly mattered. And for that, he was grateful, not just to Dr. Green, but to Emily, for giving him the chance to be better. Later that afternoon, as Emily rested, Jacob stepped out into the hallway to stretch his legs. He paced back and forth for a few minutes, his thoughts swirling as he replayed everything that had happened. His mind kept returning to Dr. Green, to the way the doctor had handled everything with such grace and professionalism. As if on cue, Dr. Green appeared at the end of the hallway, walking toward him with a clipboard in hand. He gave Jacob a nod as he approached. "Mr. Fenton," Dr. Green said, his voice calm as always. "I was just coming to check on Emily's progress. How's she doing?" "She's doing well," Jacob replied, offering a small smile. "Better every day, thanks to you." Dr. Green gave a modest nod. "I'm glad to hear that. She's made remarkable progress, and I'm confident she'll continue to improve." There was a brief silence between them, and then Jacob took a deep breath, deciding it was time to address the elephant in the room once and for all. "Dr. Green," Jacob began slowly, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened over the past few weeks, and I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Not just for how I acted, but for the way I judged you without even realizing it." Dr. Green looked at him, his expression neutral but attentive. "I was wrong," Jacob continued, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I let my own prejudices get in the way of what really mattered, Emily's health, and you proved me wrong in every way. You saved her life, and for that, I'll be forever grateful." Dr. Green regarded him for a moment, then offered a quiet smile. "Mr. Fenton, we all carry biases, whether we realize it or not. What matters is that you've recognized yours, and that you're willing to learn from this experience. That's not always easy to do." Jacob nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I'm trying, and I hope I can be a better person because of this. Not just for Emily, but for myself." Dr. Green extended his hand, and this time, Jacob didn't hesitate. He shook the doctor's hand firmly, a gesture that felt more meaningful than any words could convey. As the weeks turned into months, Emily made a full recovery, her strength returning with each passing day. Jacob watched with pride as she resumed her life, her spirit undiminished by the ordeal she had been through. She was the same vibrant, determined young woman she had always been. Only now, Jacob saw her with new eyes. The experience in the hospital had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about learning to trust others. It was about confronting the darker parts of himself that he had never wanted to acknowledge. He had been forced to face the uncomfortable truth that his own biases had nearly cost him the most precious thing in his life. But with that realization came the opportunity for growth, for change, and Jacob was determined not to let that opportunity slip through his fingers. He reached out to Dr. Green after Emily's discharge, inviting him to lunch as a way of expressing his gratitude. The two men sat together at a quiet restaurant, sharing stories of their lives, their families, and their experiences. It was a conversation Jacob never could have imagined having before the events in the hospital, but now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. As they parted ways, Jacob realized that he had not only gained a new perspective, he had gained a new friend. Dr. Green's quiet strength, his patience, and his compassion had left an indelible mark on Jacob's life, and for that, he would always be grateful. Months later, as Jacob walked through Central Park with Emily, watching her laugh and joke with friends, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The weight of the past few months had lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. He had been given a second chance, not just with Emily, but with himself, and he wasn't going to waste it. As they strolled through the park, Emily glanced up at her father, a smile playing on her lips. "You okay, Dad? You seem quiet." Jacob smiled back, nodding. "I'm okay," he said softly. "Just thinking about how lucky I am to have you." Emily laughed, rolling her eyes playfully. "Well, you're pretty lucky, I guess." Jacob chuckled, feeling his heart swell with love and gratitude. "More than you know, sweetheart." more than you know." And with that, they continued walking, side by side, the future stretching out before them, bright, hopeful, and free of the shadows of the past.